delightful day and a half with our speaker for tonight, Mike Silver. I know more about boxing than I ever did, for sure, but he's both charming and has a breadth of knowledge that is wonderful. And so what I'd like to do is read you his bio, only my computer stopped. So, one sec. Well, anyway, so Mike is from New York, born and raised. He has been interested in boxing since he was a child of 10. Just thought it was the coolest thing. You know, if you grow up in New York, you get to go to Madison Square Garden, but you also get to see all the little gyms and things like that. And so he really kept it as an avocation for most of his life. And when he as well wrote articles for boxing magazines and different things like that, and had consulted on many things. In fact, he was the curator of an exhibit on Jews in boxing at the American Jewish Historical Society in Philadelphia. So once he retired, somebody said, you should write a book, and he did. And it is not this book, because somebody told him you're not a writer until you write a second book. So he did that, and that's the book he's going to share with us tonight. He has a depth and breadth of knowledge about Jews and boxing and what it tells us about society and how it's changed. So, Mike, welcome. Oh, that's all right.
Well, thank you, Deborah. I got a real taste of Southern hospitality, thanks to Deborah, and I guess maybe Texas hospitality. This is my first trip ever to Dallas. Oh. Yeah, and I'm quite impressed, to be honest with you. And I just would like to thank personally Deborah Polsky, John Lackritz, Jenny Claes, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Claes, Joe Reingold, and Stu Rosenfeld for just the hospitality and for showing me about the town. Okay, let's get started. Today we're going to travel back in time before television, computers, the internet, going back 70, 80, 90 years ago. And when most people kept up to date with current events through newspapers, movie newsreels, and the new medium of radio. Next. Okay. In the 1920s, virtually every American knew who this young man was. He was one of the most famous Jewish persons in America. He was not a scientist, movie star, author, or Supreme Court justice. Yet he was written about and photographed more than any other Jewish entertainer or artist of his day. Can anybody recognize him?
Leonard?
Yeah, who said that? You're going to name it. Very good. Okay. I was going to say, if you can't recognize him, this is Benny in his work clothes. Now, he's one of the greatest boxers. He's acknowledged to be one of the greatest boxers who ever lived. And he's the son of Russian Jewish immigrants. And he won the lightweight title in 1917 and retired as undefeated champion 8 years later in 1925. And during his 14-year career as a boxer, he made close to $1 million. Yeah. Benny Leonard. Not only was Benny a great boxer, he was also the first Jewish sports superstar of the mass media age and the first Jewish American pop culture icon. Leonard was a brilliant boxer who fought as if playing a physical game of chess. And outside of the ring, he was intelligent and articulate. And he once challenged Bertrand Russell to a debate. The famous philosopher said boxing should be abolished. So, next. Okay. Leonard was able to attain this level of importance because in the first half of the 20th century, boxing was a major spectator sport in America. In fact, it rivaled baseball in popularity. And at the time, there were only three, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
At the time, there were only three professional sports that mattered in America: baseball, boxing, and horse racing. Now, Leonard's success and popularity inspired thousands of Jewish boys to take up boxing. And that's why the 1920s was the most prolific decade for producing Jewish fighters and world champions, especially in New York City, Leonard's hometown. Next. By the way, that's, all the movie stars, everybody wanted to be photographed with Benny Leonard. That, you recognize, that's Charlie Chaplin. When Leonard finally retired at the age of 28, his face was virtually unmarked. And that's quite remarkable since he engaged in 193 professional fights. Leonard gave as the reason for his retirement concern for his mother's health. How Jewish is that? Next. Okay. Now, that's Benny with his mom. The day following his retirement, he announced his retirement, this photo and others like it appeared in newspapers throughout the country with the headline, "Benny Leonard's mother announces his retirement." Now, a few days later, a nationally syndicated columnist for the Hearst newspapers who admired Benny's reputation as a tough boxer, as well as his participation in exhibition bouts that raised money for both Jewish and Catholic charities, wrote the following, quote, "Benny Leonard did more to conquer anti-Semitism than 1,000 textbooks, and has done more to evoke the respect of the non-Jew for the Jew than all the brilliant Jewish writers combined." Now, that's quite a statement. Whether one agrees with that or not, the very fact that those words could be written in 1925 by an editor of the largest newspaper chain in America only indicates the esteem accorded to this great champion, and also the importance of boxing to the popular culture at that time. Now, we're all familiar with the stereotype that Jews are supposed to be known for their brains and not their athletic ability. But anyone familiar with the history knows that stereotype to be untrue. And this is research, not yet, okay, go back. This is research I discovered while doing the book. Jewish athletes have won close to 400 Olympic medals, including 136 gold medals. Did you know that in 1946, the New York Knicks basketball team won their first national championship, and that 7 of the 10 players were Jewish? The fact that the average height was 5'6" didn't matter. But there is one sport that has produced more world-class Jewish professional athletes than all of the others combined. What sport do you think that was?
Boxing.
Boxing, exactly. Now, to most people, that would seem the last sport that Jews would be involved with. But as we shall see, in the context of the era in which they fought, it makes perfect sense. It would not make sense today, but at the turn of the last century into the next 3 decades, it made perfect sense. Boxing is an urban sport, and its participants have always been drawn from the poorest segments of society. Poverty breeds professional boxers. The idea to take up boxing as a profession and get hit in the head, you have to have a motivation to really, there aren't many other alternatives. When the majority of the Jews in the United States were new to this country and struggling to escape the cycle of poverty, some chose boxing as a way to improve their economic and social standing. Now, from the 1890s to the 1930s, it's estimated that over 3,000 Jewish professional boxers were active. And that represents about 7 to 10% of the total number of boxers who were active during that time. 29 became world champions, and about 200 others were rated amongst the top contenders in their respective weight divisions. By 1928, Jewish boxers had become the dominant ethnic group among title contenders in the 10 weight divisions. They achieved that. It was a short span of time, and then in the 1930s, first the Italians took over. Italian Americans became the first place, and followed by the Jewish fighters and the Irish fighters. In the 1920s and 30s, you could have gone to any gym in New York, Philadelphia, or Chicago and gotten a minion for prayer service. It's true. Now, to understand how this came about, we have to go back over 100 years ago to the turn of the last century. The growth and interest in boxing coincided with the influx from 1881 to 1924 of some 25 million new immigrants into this country. And that figure included about 2 million Jews, mostly from Poland and Russia, Eastern Europe. Now, this mostly impoverished, it was mostly an impoverished immigrant population that came here. Now, at the same time the major cities were being inundated with new immigrants, there was a steady growth in the commercialization of leisure activities in the United States, such as vaudeville, the movies, amusement parks, and sports, most significantly boxing. All were major growth industries in the early decades of the last century. Next. This scene would be familiar to many of our grandparents. It's definitely not Dallas, Texas. In the early 1900s, immigrant parents and their children lived in crowded tenement neighborhoods, and most lived at or near the poverty level, as I've said. The neighborhoods were divided by ethnicity. Jews, Irish, Italians, Poles, and other ethnic groups all had their own turf. Now, for boys growing up in these streets, fighting other immigrant gangs and amongst themselves was an everyday occurrence. Knowing how to fight was a useful survival skill. And free instruction was readily available in boys' clubs, YMHAs, settlement houses, and even public schools. Now, for those boys who wanted to take it a step further, becoming a professional fighter was an easy step. And of course, they would move up to professional, meant they would get paid for their efforts as opposed to amateur boxing. Now, at the time, there were few alternatives to the sweatshop or push cart. Only a small percentage of Jews went to college, and as you know, many industries discriminated against Jews. However, there were a few industries that did not discriminate. Show business was one, and especially the flourishing vaudeville circuit. And we all know what an impact Jews have had in show business. Now, another industry with close ties to show business was professional boxing. And like vaudeville, the sport was very accessible. Anyone could become a boxer. All you had to do was pass a rudimentary physical exam, and sometimes even that was unnecessary. Next. This is a photo of the famous Broadway Arena in Lower Manhattan. It operated in the early 1900s and is typical of the hundreds of small arenas that dotted the landscape of virtually every city in America. In New York, over 24 such arenas operated on a weekly basis within a 10-mile radius of Times Square. By the way, those white lines are not a defect in the photo. That's the electrical wiring for the overhead lights in the ring. Electricity was fairly new at the time. Next. This is an article that appeared in a 1940 edition of a New York newspaper, and it says boxing shows at 12 clubs tonight. That's 12 professional boxing shows in a single night in Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Staten Island. Today, the entire state of New York only averages about 3 boxing shows a month. And that was and the next night also, there might be another 10 shows. So it shows you how ubiquitous boxing was in the major cities. Now, the sport was attractive. By the way, people wanted to go out for a night of entertainment. They either went to the movies, vaudeville, or the fights. Boxing was attractive to young men because it was an opportunity to make quick money. And it was common knowledge that boxers were the highest paid athletes in the world. A contender could make thousands of dollars just for one fight. And in 1927, Gene Tunney, the heavyweight champion, was paid $1 million for defending his title against Jack Dempsey. Now, by comparison, Babe Ruth, who was the highest paid baseball player and its biggest star, made $80,000 that same year. But, and this is key to this whole topic, is that even a preliminary boxer, just getting started, could make more money in one 4-round bout than his father could earn working an entire week in a sweatshop. But the benefit to the larger Jewish community went beyond monetary. Jewish heroes were in short supply in poor immigrant neighborhoods, and successful boxers filled that gap. boxing was much more important to society than it is today. And the sport was considered a test of character and courage. And so successful ethnic boxers who fought their way out of poverty became instant heroes in their neighborhoods. Now, of course, Jewish Nobel Prize winners, famous authors, and show business stars were all well and good. But those achievements did not earn the same type of respect the general public accorded to champion prize fighters. And for a people new to this country, it was more important at that time that they proved they could succeed in the most popular and toughest of all sports, and thereby earn the respect of their fellow Americans. Now, few images were more powerful than a newspaper photo of a Jewish fighter wearing the Star of David on his trunks or robe, standing over a defeated opponent and having his hand raised in victory. Right? That happens to be Al Davis, who was known as Al Bunny Davis. I don't know if anybody heard of him. He was a big star in the late 30s. Next. Just another photo. And, now, the very first Jewish American athlete to achieve international prominence was this fighter. Next. This is Joe Kowinski of San Francisco. He fought from 1886 to 1903. Kowinski was the son of Polish immigrants and is one of the few fighters who did not come from a poverty-stricken background. His father attended Yale University and published one of the first earliest Jewish American newspapers. He is considered one of the greatest boxers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He was a small heavyweight at 5 foot 10 inches. He weighed about 170 pounds and often defeated opponents who weighed 60 or 70 pounds more than he did. At the time, there was no light heavyweight division, so any fighter who weighed over 160 had to fight in the heavyweight division. In 1901, he knocked out the future heavyweight champion Jack Johnson, who some experts consider the greatest heavyweight of all time. Now, after the bout, which, by the way, took place in Galveston, Texas, both fighters were arrested. In fact, the governor of Texas ordered both fighters arrested because boxing was illegal in the state at that time. The governor was running for re-election at the time, so he wanted to make an impression that he was looking out for the public good. Next. Johnson and Kowinski served 2 weeks in the same jail cell. This is the sheriff, wanted his picture taken, there's the deputies. There. However, as celebrities, both were allowed to go home in the evening. Johnson went to his home in Galveston, and Kowinski went to his hotel. But they were required to report back the next morning. And Kowinski, in his autobiography, Johnson, in his autobiography, credited Kowinski with refining his boxing style and teaching him many tricks of the experienced boxer. Now, about 2/3 of the Jewish boxers who were active during the Golden Age came from New York City, and most of those from the Lower East Side. Now, that's not surprising, since at the turn of the last century, there were about 500,000 Jews in New York, and they comprised the largest and poorest Jewish population in the country. One of the very first Jewish stars to emerge from the Lower East Side, boxing stars, was this man, the colorfully named Leech Cross, whose real name was Louis Wallach. Now, what makes his story so interesting is that before Leech became a leading contender for the lightweight championship, he graduated from the NYU Dental School in 1907, and he thereby earning the nickname the Fighting Dentist. During the day, he was Dr. Louis Wallach, and at nights he was Leech Cross professional prize fighter. So I guess you could say in one career he knocked out a few teeth, in the other career he fixed them. Leech eventually suspended his practice about a year into his boxing career because he found out he could make much more money as a fighter than as a dentist. Next. Now, this is a photo of Leech in his dental office. This photo was given to me about a year ago. I spoke at a synagogue in Long Island, and a person came up to me from the audience and said, my father was a patient. He was about 90. He said, my father was a patient of Leech Cross. And he gave me this photo. When Leech finally hung up his gloves in 1916, he had engaged in nearly 150 professional fights. By the 1920s, boxing had overtaken baseball as America's most popular sport. Every ethnic group produced its share of boxers, but the sons of Irish, Jewish, and Italian immigrants were the most numerous and dominant groups within the sport. Movie newsreels, newspapers, magazine stories, and radio broadcasts fanned interest in the sport. And in this new mass media age, athletic heroes and movie stars were the biggest celebrities. Now, boxing reached into virtually every city. Epic prize fights attracted tens of thousands of people, and in 2 instances, over 100,000, as in this photo. This is a photograph of the famous Jack Dempsey versus George Carpentier heavyweight title fight, which took place in July 1921. Dempsey, along with Babe Ruth, were the biggest sports stars of the Roaring '20s. Now, over 90,000 people paid over $2 million to see this fight, which was a record at the time. Dempsey defended his title against Carpentier, who was a former French war hero, very dashing, looked like a movie star. So, by the way, a new arena had to be built to accommodate. No arena was big enough to hold this amount of people. So Tex Rickard, the promoter, built an entirely new arena on the New Jersey side of the Hudson River, not far from where the current Giants Stadium currently is housed. Now, the ringside was filled with stars of stage and screen, mayors, governors, captains of industry. Ringside seats went for $50. That's about $1,000 in today's money. And that's at a time when the average weekly wage, no, keep it here, average weekly wage was about $25. This was the first title fight to be broadcast over radio. And as you can, by the way, the cheapest seat in the arena was $5. But even with binoculars, the ring wouldn't appear much bigger than a postage stamp. But that didn't matter. People just wanted to be there. It was a historical event. This fight is credited with jump-starting the golden age of sports in America, when promoters realized that there was tremendous money to be made in sports, and especially boxing. Next. This is a photo. This is not the sports page. This is the front page of the New York Times the day after the fight. Maybe it was a slow news day, but 6 of the 8 stories below that headline were devoted to the fight. In fact, if you look, you can't see it to the left. The article to the left says, "Harding ends war, signs peace decree." So, the Roaring '20s were a very interesting decade. The war actually ended a year and a half earlier, but the peace treaty was signed at that time. Next. This is the program from the 1923 lightweight title fight between Benny Leonard and Lou Tendler, his top challenger. Over 60,000 fans paid to see 2 Jewish boxers fight it out for the lightweight title. Now, this was one of 14 times between 1910 and 1934 in which Jewish boxers fought each other for a world title. But as brave and tough as Jewish boxers were, they did fear one personage above all others. Can anybody guess who that was? Who said that? Somebody said that? What did you say?
I said their mothers.
Their mothers. You know, every time I've spoken, when I ask that question, a woman always answers. Never fails. Boxing, along with other American pastimes, was foreign to the values and traditions of immigrant parents. Most considered it a shanda for a Jewish son to take up boxing as a profession. It was almost as bad as becoming a gangster or an actor. So in order to avoid family conflict, many boxers kept their parents from finding out, at least initially, by fighting under another name. Even the great Benny Leonard changed his name to keep his parents from finding out. His real name was Benjamin Leonard. Next. This is Benny Leonard posing in the ring in the gym in 1922 in his prime. You can see he was a handsome, clean-cut individual. Whenever Benny boxed or sparred or even jumped rope, all action stopped in the gym. All eyes were on him. You just watch him. Now, Leonard was fond of telling the following story, no doubt repeated in many Jewish households when parents found out their sons had become boxers. One night, Benny came home with a black eye and could no longer hide the fact that he was a boxer. Now, his parents were Orthodox Jews, and they were horrified to find this out. Benny had to confess that he was a boxer. His mother wept, and his father was furious. He admonished Benny How dare you disgrace the family? Bum, trumpeting, he yelled at Benny. For what do you fight? For what? Poor Benny, head bowed, reached into his pocket and handed his father the $20 he had earned for his forehand preliminary that night. His father, a poor tailor who had to work in a sweatshop 14 hours a day to earn $20 for a week, took Benny aside and whispered in his ear so his mother would not hear, Benny, when do you fight again? True story. Now, taking an Irish name had particular appeal, especially for boxers who lived in cities without a large Jewish population. This accomplished the dual role of hiding their identity from disapproving parents and also enhancing their marketability, because Irish fighters had dominated the boxing scene in America for most of the 19th century, and they had built a reputation as tough crowd pleasers. So taking an Irish name made sense. So what developed was the interesting phenomenon of dozens of Jewish fighters taking Irish names. And many more Italian fighters took Irish names because there was a lot of prejudice towards Italians at that time. One Jewish fighter I came across during my research tried to bridge both worlds, and he billed himself as Irish Benny Cohen. Two Jewish boxers with Irish names won world title. This fighter on the left, that's Al McCoy. Okay, his real name is Albert Mueller, and he was a middleweight champion 1916 to 1919, and he's pictured here with his trainer Charlie Goldman. I don't know if you know, many of you are boxing fans, but Charlie Goldman later became famous as the trainer of heavyweight champion, the undefeated heavyweight champion Rocky Marciano. Goldman was also an ex-fighter, had over 200 fights. And just as an aside, in the Rocky movie, Sylvester Stallone named the trainer of the fictional Rocky Mickey Goldmill. That was as an homage to Charlie Goldman. Next. Anybody recognize this fighter? This is Mushy Callahan. Mushy Callahan was the junior welterweight champ from 1926 to 1929. He fought out of Los Angeles. His real name was Morris Shear. Mushy was a derivation of his Hebrew name, Moish. Moish Callahan wouldn't have made it, but Mushy Callahan. Sounds very... Now, Jewish fight fans always supported their fighters and came out in droves to cheer them on. By the mid-1920s, Jewish boxers had become so numerous and popular that taking an Irish name was no longer necessary. In fact, some fighters thought their names didn't sound ethnic enough. So Charles Green became Charlie Phil Rosenberg. Junior welterweight champ John Baddock, who started his career as Kid Murphy, reinvented himself as Jack Bernstein. Future light heavyweight champion Barney Lebrowitz changed his name to the more colorful-sounding Battling Levinsky. There were also a few Kid Sampsons, several King Solomons. One of those King Solomons, the most active of whom he was exposed as a Gentile from Panama. Now, interestingly, Jewish fighters were many times were identified on fight posters or in articles with the word Hebrew, not Jewish, as in the Hebrew KO King or Hebrew Challenger. I'm not really sure why that was. Perhaps because the word brought to mind the ancient Hebrew warriors of the Bible. Or it just sounded better. Next. This is a photo taken just after future heavyweight champion Max Baer knocked out the German heavyweight champion Max Schmeling in June of 1933 before 60,000 people in Yankee Stadium. That's Baer on the left with the Jewish star. Baer's knockout of Schmeling took place 5 months after the Nazis came to power in Germany. Now, Baer's grandfather on his father's side was Jewish, and he was not raised in the Jewish religion, and it's really unclear if he identified himself as Jewish. He had a Jewish manager, and when he came to the East Coast, his manager said, "Wear a Jewish star. It'll bring in the fans," which it did. Now, nevertheless, this victory made him an instant hero of the Jews throughout the world. And by wearing the Star of David and telling the press he would punish his opponent for what was happening in Germany, Max chose to identify with the Jewish people at that time. And his Jewish fans are forever grateful for the stand he took. Now, because boxing is an international sport, unlike baseball or American football, Jewish boxers who lived in Germany and other European countries were impacted by events happening in the 1930s. Very few people know that one of the first official acts of the German government was to ban all Jewish boxers from competing in Germany. Next. This is a photo of an article that appeared in the New York Times. It appeared in the sports section of all places. I don't know if you can read it, but it says, Germany puts ban on Jews in boxing. New move toward complete ostracism of athletes also bars managers. Now keep in mind, this was 2 years before the Nuremberg laws were enacted, which essentially revoked all civil rights of Jewish citizens of Germany. Now you wonder, why boxing? Why was it important enough to do this? Well, the Nazis put great importance on sports, and particularly boxing, which was very popular in Germany at the time. For a Jew to defeat a German boxer was humiliating, so banning all Jewish boxers made sure that this was not going to happen, at least not on German soil. 6 weeks earlier, Germany's light heavyweight champion was soundly defeated by Maxi Rosenblum, the light heavyweight champion. And that was in Madison Square Garden. And historians believe that that result prompted this ban in Germany. Next. This is a photo of Erich Selig. He was the middleweight and light heavyweight champion of Germany in the late 20s and early 30s. He was also Jewish. The day after the ban went into effect, he was scheduled to defend one of his titles in Germany. And on the night of the fight, Nazi officials came into his dressing room and said if he went ahead with the fight, he would be killed. So that night, later that night, he fled Germany with his family. And first to France and then to America, where he continued his career. He was lucky. Other well-known European Jewish boxers and athletes were not. This is a photo of Victor Young Perez, who was the bantamweight champion of the world in 1931. He was a Sephardic Jew born in Algeria, but had been living in Paris since the 1920s. Now, during the occupation of Paris by the Germans, he was arrested and sent to Auschwitz in 1943. When it was found out that he was a former champion boxer, Perez was forced to engage in brutal boxing matches with other prisoners for the amusement of the guards. In January 1945, with the Soviet army approaching, he and thousands of other prisoners were forced to march in freezing weather towards Germany. On the 5th day of the march, he found a sack of bread in an abandoned concentration camp near the Czech border. He was shot while trying to distribute the bread to his fellow prisoners. Next. This is Kid Francis. He was born in Italy but raised in Marseille. He was a top-rated bantamweight in the late 1920s and early 30s. He fought 27 times in New York City. He was very popular there. He returned to Europe, and in 1933 lost the decision to young Perez, previous fighter, in Paris. Unfortunately, he suffered the same fate as his former opponent. He was deported to Auschwitz and murdered 5 months before Perez arrived. Next. This is Leon Afrati. He's Italian-born, and before the war he was one of Europe's finest featherweight boxers. He arrived in the U.S. in 1938 to challenge for the featherweight title. Lost a close decision. In 1939 he was deported back to Italy, which at the time was an ally of Germany. Attempts were made by his American friends to keep him here, but the State Department refused to allow him to stay, and he was deported back to Italy. 4 years later, he was arrested in Rome, sent to Auschwitz, where he was killed. Now, the grim news coming out of Germany in the 1930s only intensified the pride American Jews already took in their fighters. And wearing the Star of David on their trunks and robes took on added significance at this time. Next. Just a few examples of fighters who wore the Star of David in the ring. This is schoolboy Bernie Friedkin, featherweight contender in the 30s. I actually knew him. He was from Brooklyn. And he was called schoolboy because he turned pro at the age of 17 while he was still in high school. Next. This is Sammy Farber, who was a featherweight and lightweight in the 1930s. I actually knew Sammy also. He actually lived about 5 minutes from me. And He passed away about 10 years ago at the age of 94. Next. This is Jackie Kid Bird, one of the greatest fighters to come out of England. And Jackie always wore the Jewish star with his Hebrew initials, and he fought many times in America, was very popular, a great fighter. He outdid all the other Jewish fighters who would wear the star. He actually wore into the Madison Square Garden ring for a main event his tallis and tefillin. It's true. The next day, the New York Times had to explain what tefillin were. Next, this is Julie Kogan, outstanding fighter, came out of New Haven, Connecticut. Now, because of the popularity of Jewish boxers in cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago, which had the large Jewish populations, and the Jewish fans were the biggest fans. I mean, any big fight, sometimes a quarter of a third of the audience were Jewish fight fans. At that time, some Gentile fighters thinking, hey, maybe I should fight under a Jewish name. So, and they did. There were quite a few non-Jewish fighters who took Jewish names. Probably the most famous was the great Italian-American lightweight champion Salvatore Mandela, who fought under the more ethnic-sounding Sammy Mandel. In my book, I list about a dozen main bout Italian fighters who took Jewish names. Now, so it was ironic because while some Jewish boxers in Germany were fleeing for their lives, some Gentile boxers in America, including the heavyweight champion Max Baer, were pretending to be Jews. Next. While every English language newspaper in America recorded the accomplishments of the fighters and the Yiddish paper with the largest circulation, the Daily Forward, virtually ignored the sport. Had a circulation of 400,000, and they rarely reported boxing. They considered it, I guess, too goyish an activity for nice Jewish boys. But by the late 1920s, with Jewish boxing activity at its zenith, even they could not ignore the sport. So they actually started a boxing column. And this is from 1929 issue, and I don't know if you can, it's in Hebrew lettering at the top. It says in Yiddish, but it reads, "In the world of sports." And on the left it says boxing, and that's a picture of Izzy Schwartz, who was the flyweight champion. On the right, you'll notice in Hebrew lettering it says soccer. Why soccer? Soccer was very popular amongst the European immigrants. It was tremendously popular, so they recorded all the soccer scores. Next. Jewish boxing stars were always ready to lend a helping hand to charitable causes. In October 1929, 2 months after Arab terrorists murdered 67 Jews in the Hebron massacre, in what was then known as the British Mandate of Palestine, the subway builder Sam Rossoff rented the entire Madison Square Garden ring to stage five matches, boxing matches, between 5 Jewish fighters and 5 Gentile fighters. The show was to raise money for the beleaguered Jews of pre-state Israel. They raised $100,000. 16,000 fans attended the fights, and they raised $100,000. It's doubtful if any other sport or theatrical event could have raised that kind of money. But Jews were not only by the way, all 5 Jewish boxers won their fights. But Jews were not only stars inside the ring, they were also stars outside of the ring. They were dominant figures and were the most influential managers, promoters, gym owners, trainers, and publishers of boxing periodicals. Actually, boxing was as much a Jewish industry as the Garment Center or Hollywood. And that's why there was virtually no anti-Semitism in those industries. I just want to give you a few examples of that. This is the famous Stillman's gym. How many people here have heard of Stillman's gym? Okay. This was a world-famous gym. It operated owned by a Jew. It operated from 1919 to 1961. And it was located on 8th Avenue between 54th and 55th Street. And next. This is a photo of the interior of the gym, taken in 1949, I think. And you see it had rows of seats for spectators. It had 2 large rings. It also had a second floor with a training bags were located and the punching bags. I actually had the good fortune, as a kid, my father took me there for boxing lessons. So I actually worked out in this gym the last 2 years of its existence. This gym is world famous. People from all over the world considered it, many people from all over the world considered it as much a New York attraction as the Statue of Liberty or Radio City Music Hall. And it was a very colorful place to go because you could be guaranteed to see actors there, or famous writers, and gangsters. You could see gangsters. Definitely. Next. Okay, this is the famous Ring magazine, which was started by Nat Fleischer in 1922. It operated under his leadership for the next 50 years, and it became known as the Bible of boxing. I counted from 1922 to 1949, 42 covers that featured a Jewish boxer on the cover. That's more than any other national magazine to make that claim. Next. This is the logo of the famous Everlast Company. It was started by Russian Jewish immigrants in 1911, and for the next 70 years was the largest manufacturer of boxing equipment in the world. Next. This is a photo of promoter Mike Jacobs. He's pictured here with Joe Louis, famous heavyweight champion Joe Louis. Mike Jacobs was the head of Madison Square Garden and the sport's premier promoter during the 1930s and 40s. Jacobs made it possible for Joe Louis to get a shot at the heavyweight championship in 1937, a title Louis held for the next 12 years. Louis became an American icon and one of the country's key black figures of the 20th century. His dignified demeanor, brilliant record as champion, and service in World War II paved the way for Jackie Robinson to break the color barrier in professional baseball in 1947. So I guess you could say Mike Jacobs had something to do with that. One of the most colorful fighters of the 1930s was this man. Anybody recognize him?
That's Slapsy Maxie Rosenblum?
Right, Slapsy Maxie Rosenblum. Very good. Slapsy Maxie held the light heavyweight title from 1930 to 1934. He was a very active fighter. He fought on average every 3 weeks. And his hands, which were of course the tools of his trade, often became painful and swollen. So early in his career, he developed a style that allowed him to slap his opponents with an open hand instead of hitting them with a closed fist. There go the nickname Slapsy Maxie, which was conferred on him by the famous writer Damon Runyon. I guess you could say Maxie was a non-violent boxer. His style was intended to cause the least amount of damage to himself or his opponents, but still come away with a win. So, as he said in his own words, I don't want to hurt nobody, I just want to slap him around. During the course of his amazing 16-year career, he engaged in an incredible 297 professional fights. Scored only 19 knockouts. Probably by accident. There are some experts who rate him the greatest light heavyweight boxer of all time. Actually, more people remember Maxie as an actor, because after he retired from the ring, he began a second career as a comedic character actor in motion pictures, and he appeared in over 100 movies and television productions. In fact, in this movie he had star billing. Notice the cauliflower ear. See that? I actually found this movie on YouTube. It's awful. But Maxie does a good job. It wasn't much of a stretch. Next. Okay, here's Maxie at a movie premiere in 1939. And some older fans will recognize Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney. And notice how they're looking at Maxie. I always like, just looking at Maxie, staring at him. But by the way, that's Maxie's new wife. He had married her a few weeks earlier. And what's interesting is that she was a PhD and a highly educated child psychologist. Maxie never made it past the 6th grade. But The marriage lasted 9 years, in case you're interested. Now, probably the first person most people think of when asked to name a Jewish boxer is this next person. How many people here?
Barney Ross.
Right, this is Barney Ross. In the 1930s, Barney won the lightweight, junior welterweight, and welterweight titles, becoming only the third fighter up to that time to win championships in 3 separate weight divisions. He was hugely popular, and his epic bouts with Irish Jimmy McLarnin and Italian champion Tony Canzoneri are legendary. Next. Now this is Barney. This photo was taken shortly after he won the lightweight championship from Tony Canzoneri, and he was from Chicago, and he was given a parade down LaSalle Avenue, and that's his mom next to him. He was still single, so his mom got to ride in the car. And that's the mayor of Chicago, who's hatless in the front seat. Interestingly, again, doing research, found that Barney's mother was very orthodox, very observant. And when Barney fought Friday nights at the Chicago Stadium, she would not let anybody drive her. She insisted on walking to the stadium, which was over 3 miles away. But she didn't walk alone. Half the neighborhood went with her, with Barney's fans. So, and on going back, she had to walk back. This time Barney accompanied her back after the fight with half the neighborhood. Ross beat Jimmy McLarnin for the welterweight title in 1934 in front of 60,000 people at New York's Polo Grounds. And his victory was cause for great rejoicing because Jimmy McLarnin had knocked out a number of top Jewish fighters. Barney lost the title back to McLarnin, but 6 months later regained it, and in their third and final fight. I don't know if we can go to the next one. Okay. Yeah, go down here and click on the arrow. There should be an arrow. Take the mouse. Yeah, click on that arrow. Right. Go ahead. See how this goes. I'll just show you a short clip, a little bit of the action of the last round, the last fight between McLarnin and that's Ross on the left. McLarnin. Now they've already gone 14 tough rounds at a fast pace. It's a close fight. This is the last round. That's Jack Dempsey is the referee. Okay, that gives you some. Go back to the last photo in the car. Right, okay. Ross retired. By the way, Ross was never knocked out and lost only 4 of 82 professional fights. He retired in 1938. When World War II broke out, he volunteered for the Marine Corps. Now, he was one of 500,000 American Jews who served in the armed forces during World War II. He was 32 years old. He didn't have to serve, but not only did he volunteer for the Marine Corps, he asked for combat duty. He could have easily boxed exhibitions and entertained the troops, but he requested combat duty. So, less than 10 months after enlisting, he was on Guadalcanal fighting the Japanese. He was awarded the Silver Star for heroism, for saving the lives of 2 Marine buddies, and fighting off an enemy attack. Ross was wounded and contracted malaria. He was treated with morphine and unfortunately developed an addiction and later became a full-blown heroin addict. He had an addictive personality. He was a great fighter, but he was an inveterate gambler. And later on, after he retired, he became a smoker. He had sort of an addictive personality. Unfortunately, that was one of his weaknesses. In 1946, after his wife threatened to leave him, Ross voluntarily entered a federal recovery center in an attempt to beat the habit. And in a battle far tougher than any of his opponents, he did overcome the addiction, and thereafter led a productive life, and often speaking out against the evils of drug addiction. 2 books and 2 movies have been based on his life. Next. Next. Beginning in 1947, Ross was actively involved in raising hundreds of thousands of dollars for the future state of Israel. He was also involved in activities that smuggled arms and men into the region. And throughout his life, he remained a strong and committed supporter of Israel. This photo shows Ross signing up with the George Washington Legion, an organization formed to recruit Jewish American war veterans to fight in Israel in their War of Independence. However, when the State Department found out that Ross was planning to go to Israel to fight, they threatened to take his passport, and because it was illegal for an American citizen to fight under a foreign flag at the time. So he stayed in the U.S., where he continued to raise thousands of dollars for the state of Israel. Ross, more than any other Jewish boxer, personified the spirit of the fighting Jew. In the years leading up to World War II, as the hardships of the Depression eased, the number of Jewish boxers began to decline. In the aftermath of World War II, Congress enacted the GI Bill of Rights, which enabled returning veterans to get a free college education or technical training. So many young men who might have chosen a career in boxing now had other more stable opportunities and safer opportunities. The GI Bill and the booming economy actually jump-started the modern middle class in America. That's responsible for that. It was also responsible for downsizing professional boxing in this country, because of the, especially as it pertained to white fighters who weren't coming into the sport. So since you had fewer Jewish, Irish, and Italian young men turning to the ring, taking up the slack now were African American and Hispanic boxers who were still at the lower rung of society. And of course, they would move to the forefront of the sport in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond. By the early 1950s, the golden age of the Jewish boxer had come to a close. But for an entire generation, this sport had played an important part in the Americanization process for both the fighters and their fans. Now today I've highlighted only a few of the great Jewish boxers. Most are forgotten. My book was intended to change that by shining a spotlight on the 29 Golden Age Jewish champions and 137 other notable Jewish boxers, and to put their stories in historical context. Collectively, it's the story of an immigrant people striving to overcome adversity and enter the economic and social mainstream, and earn respect. These men have left a wonderful legacy of which we can all be proud, and they should not be forgotten. Thank you.
We've got time for a few questions.
Yeah.
And we're going to turn the lights off. There we go. Questions?
What about Golden Gloves? I used to fight in the Golden Gloves.
Did you fight in the Golden Gloves? What year did you fight?
What year? You asking? Let me think. I'm 95 now, I have to think back. I don't know, I'm born 21, so.
21, so like late 30s?
Yeah.
How far did you go in the gloves?
Oh, I did all right.
I would guess you're about 112 to 118 pounds. Right.
Below a welterweight.
Yeah, that's great. The Golden Gloves are still on. They don't attract nearly as many fighters as they used to. Again, downsizing the boxing. I'll give you an example. The Golden Gloves used to have about 2,000 entries. Now they have about 400 in New York City. That's the New York Golden Gloves.
My mother never knew about it.
No. Just as an aside, Woody Allen, when he was 16 years old, began training in a gym. He wanted to enter the Golden Gloves. And he had a trainer, and at that age, you needed your mother to sign, your parents to sign a release. So he went to his mother, and she said, "No way, absolutely not." That's not good. That's interesting, yes.
I didn't have to get my mother. I didn't have to get anybody to sign.
No? That came later. That was in the 1950s. Because they found underage fighters going into the gloves, 14, 15 years old. Yeah.
Any questions?
It's terrific. I always meet an ex-fighter. It's always somebody new, an ex-fighter, an ex-fighter.
We just saw the movie, since you mentioned Rocky, we just saw the movie Chuck, which
Oh, yeah.
didn't come out too much. It's about a Jewish fighter from Bayonne.
But he wasn't Jewish.
He wasn't Jewish?
No.
They claim he
Chuck Lefty.
was.
No, Chuck Lefty was not Jewish. Not in the movie, no.
Well, not in the movie, but they claim he was. Well, when I
Whoever played
looked him
that
up on the
wrong.
internet, I guess he wasn't. Well, forget
But he's a
it.
very nice guy, I know Chuck, he's a terrific guy.
Yeah, well, it was just hysterical because, the movie went nowhere. His manager was Jewish though, right?
Of course.
Yeah. So when, in this movie, Chuck is like the only fighter that went 15 rounds against Muhammad
Yes,
Ali
that's
and,
right.
and stood.
That's right.
Stood afterwards.
He inspired
And when the funny part of the movie is when the manager fixed up this fight. He had just finished fighting George Foreman in what was it, in the jungle,
Yes.
Rumble in the Jungle.
Right.
And he says, "I got a Schwarzer Putz for you." That was a funny. Nobody in the audience. The movie didn't go anywhere, so nobody in the audience knew what that meant. Here in the Magnolia. And I thought it was a funny film, but it didn't go anywhere. So he's not
No.
Jewish?
No, he's not.
That's a disappointment.
Yes.
Oh, well.
Did you know any boxers that left Europe and went to Shanghai?
Oh, yes, yes. I have a whole chapter in my book
Oh.
about the fighters who went to Shanghai. Now, what happened during World War II and before World War II, the only place really that would take any significant number of Jews was Shanghai, China, believe it or not. And about 20,000 Jews eventually made it to Shanghai, many from Germany and also from Eastern Europe. In fact, my father's first cousin who became a rabbi, was one of the Shanghai Jews, and there is a member of my congregation who was a fighter in Shanghai. They had, because they had 20,000 Jews, they created a whole society, as Jews always do. They get, let's have clubs, and let's have lectures, and newspapers, and athletic clubs. And they had the boxing in Shanghai. And in fact, there's another shul I belong to where a woman was married to one of the champions in Shanghai. And she just passed away recently, and his picture is in the book, one of the Shanghai fighters. So if you're interested, buy my book.
Did you know Harry Ruckenstein?
Yes, Ruckelstein, he's one of the fighters.
He lived in Dallas.
Did
He
he?
was a caterer that married 3 of my children here in
Whoa, how do you like that? I mentioned him in my book. His name is mentioned in my book. Wow, that is, look at that. It's amazing. Yes, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I fought 6 cage fights in the Navy. And all Christian guys.
Yeah.
And I was the only Jew on my ship.
Wow.
And it was called the cargo attack ship. KA-98. And when I lost the 2 fights, everyone ignored me. When I won, they crowded around me. But there was always the sign, "Beat the Jew." Beat the Jew. And I never forgot that.
No kidding.
And that enraged me and brought me to win more than I should have.
Wow, that's great. That was on the ship they had that
Yeah.
sign? That's interesting. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in the service, fighters who, you were in
The
World War
only Jew on a
II.
ship, let me tell you,
Wow.
anti-Semitism is a profession.
Yeah. That was World War II? Thank you for your service. Yeah. Oh, sure. I mean, gambling was a big part of the sport. I mean, they gambled on fighters, they gambled on, like, horse racing. They gambled on horse racing. And, there was the mob with infiltrated boxing, and there were fixed fights, okay? Most of the fights were on the level, okay? And those fights were fixed, the audience usually knew it. And especially people in boxing knew it. But, well, not as bad, that's really all fixed, but there were fixed fights, but the majority of fights were not, okay? But there were some high-profile fights that were fixed. And,
I would tell you that 50% of the fighters got fixed.
well, I don't know if it's, what year are you talking about? What year? When? 50s, 40s, 30s, when? 40s? There was a lot, the mob was heavily involved in fights. I don't think it's that high. There was a certain, I ought to do that, I ought to see the percentage, but there were a certain percentage of the big fights where a big, gambling coup could, the smaller fights nobody cared about really. It was just, So since most of the fights were not major fights, most of those fights were not fixed. If you're just dealing with some of the bigger fights, I'd have to check on that. I don't think it was as high as 50%, but
It just seemed like that.
yeah, it might have seemed like that. Maybe in the 1950s, when the mob really was very strong. But again, only in some major fights. Yeah.
We got time for one last question, and then we gotta
Yes.
go.
You might remember there was a fighter about 18 years ago, Dana Rosenblatt.
Rosenblatt, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll never forget, he fought Vinny Pazienza. They
Right.
fought twice.
Twice,
In
yeah.
the second fight, went to a decision,
Right.
and Rosenblatt was so nervous they were tabulating the scorecard.
Yeah.
He's crossing himself.
Really? Dana Rosenblatt?
Yeah.
All right, see, we'll start. Just let me know one more. Anybody else? Yeah.
I was just curious, first of all, I enjoyed your talk, it was great, but have you done any research also on Daniel Mendoza? Are you interested in that
Absolutely.
also?
I have a
And do you have
whole-
any books or?
Whole section, well, a great book just came out. It's one of the, like a pictorial book that came out on Daniel Mendoza. And it's very good.
Okay.
Yeah, and it came out less than a year ago. You might want to look into that. I also cover Mendoza in my book. I didn't have time to cover him.
Right, no, I understand.
But he was the
It's a
first
different
great
era.
British fighter. Wonderful, yes.
Do you have any books here to sell?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
You mentioned the world of professional wrestling, and there were Jews in that.
Yes,
too.
absolutely.
And one of the most famous was named Ray Stern, and he lived down here, and I happened to know him.
Wow.
And that's a real character, and that's an odd world.
Yeah, that's a whole other world, and there were many terrific, especially in Europe too, terrific Jewish wrestlers. Yeah. Your husband too, oh.
We want to thank Mike for yeah, Michael's going to be in the back outside with signing books out there. If you are an incoming board member, come up here. We're going to get a picture with Cody. And thank you very much for coming.